Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of our Fireside Chats. I'm Pallavi Ade, along with Shreyas Deshmukh. We are the co-founders of Asian Pathfinders, and welcome to another edition of a Saturday morning Fireside Chat. Today's discussion is on India's internal security, successes and challenges ahead with former Home Secretary Gopal Pillai. So thank you so for joining us and thank you, Vijayta. Before I hand it over to Vijayta, who's our moderator, just a brief about Asian Pathfinders. And before that, I would really wish everyone is safe and sound at their home and healthy. I know these are difficult times, especially in India, but I know other parts of the world also suffering. So please stay safe and take care. But moving on to today's session. So about Asian Pathfinders, we started in 2020. We're actually approaching our 1 year anniversary soon. So yeah, thank you everyone who supported through the year. And we are a knowledge sharing platform where we aim to bring scholars, practitioners, academics together for constructive dialogues and on multidisciplinary topics, right? So last week we had India's health security. Today we have internal security. And next week, as I would tell you later, it's on climate disasters and the security matters related to it. And we do that through different sessions that we hold. We hold fireside chats, which are on Saturdays, and dialogue, which is the last Thursday of every month. And we aim to be an informal forum, so we welcome feedback and participation from everyone. Again, please put your questions and comments in the chat section. Anything from, because everyone comes from different experiences, so it's great to hear from your experience too. And about our upcoming sessions, so basically we have Colonel Arjun Katoj will be speaking on climate disaster management, which is on May 22nd. And after that, we have a panel discussion, a dialogue, as we call it. It's on analyzing India's internal security environment. So we'll have experts from a couple of different walks of life who will be speaking on this topic. So you can always follow our social media to know about the registration details. We keep our events open. We just ask you to register. That's all. So thank you. And guidelines, there are not much. It's just that please stay on mute because we record these sessions and put it on YouTube later. Again, respect the views of others. A lot of these topics are very emotive. So let's have a constructive discussion about these topics. And I think that's how we can further our understanding of what these topics also. Obviously, how you can get in touch with us. That's look up Asian Pathfinders. I think it's there everywhere now, I think. And moving on to today's session, I know Vijayta will be making her opening remarks and introducing her, but just before I do that, I'll introduce Vijayta. Vijayta is a Delhi-based journalist with special interest in internal security. She has been reporting on parliament, crime, and national politics for the past 15 years. She has worked for the Pioneer, the Hindustan Times, the Indian Express, and Vijayta is currently the deputy editor with the National Bureau at the Hindu. So over to you, Vijayta.
Thank you, Pallavi. Thanks for this opportunity. The topic that you have chosen is India's internal security, successes and challenges. So, as a reporter and as a fly on the wall, what we are seeing right now, the most immediate and long-term challenge that we face today is COVID. Not only in terms of health, but its spillover on economy. There is rural and urban distress both. It cannot be the case that this distress is not visible in our day-to-day life. You must be knowing somebody or the other who has lost his or her job, who has been laid off. So it's not only the underprivileged, but a lot of middle class, a lot of upper middle class who are being affected by COVID. And if I may take the liberty, I see this impacting the social fabric in the country as well. Until there is peace and until there is tranquility, there cannot be any sustainable development. A country cannot prosper if majority of its population is, under duress or is unhappy. And COVID, as we have seen, you must have witnessed, it has led to a lot of inequalities, and that all of us must be seeing around us. And the government has announced schemes and packages, but this needs cogent and decisive action, both short-term as well as long-term. I'm not an expert on economy, but these things are directly related to peaceful coexistence. if there are a lot of street crimes, such as robbery or chain snatching, it does impact the internal security. It is not merely a police problem, then it becomes a societal issue. The second issue that we face right now is the Chinese aggression at the border. Though the government announced that there was disengagement at Pangong Tso, North and South Bands both, but that was merely an 8-kilometer stretch. There is considerable Chinese presence at other locations in eastern Ladakh, and the de-escalation, as you say, the moving back of troops from both sides is yet to take place. So, and it has been almost a year. So that is another area which has to be looked at, because these were the areas within India's perception of the unsettled line of actual control, where Indian troops used to usually go for patrolling. Now they cannot go. That right has been blocked. So I don't see any discussion or any other statement coming from the government on this particular aspect. But this is a problem that has been lingering on for a year, and this is an area of concern according to me. And thirdly, the rising instances of communal events in the country. Not all of them necessarily may lead to violent incidents, but the kind of impact it is creating in the ecosystem, country's ecosystem, in the discourse, in the discussions that we are having, even on public platforms. That is also something to be looked at very, very, what do I say, with a lot of concern. And a large part of our discourse these days is spent on which God is superior, instead of scientific temper, and we should be talking about other stuff. This is what, like, in personal opinion. And visible success that we see is the left-wing extremism corridor. Around 10 states are affected by this, but we have seen in the past decade meaningful gains have been made. And if I may recall, a separate desk to deal with Maoism or Naxalism or LWE, whatever you may want to call it, it was created in the Union Home Ministry only in the year 2006. Before that, it was just one of the many topics that was, one of the many desks that was being handled by a joint secretary. So the importance that this could pose in the real future was realized then, and the progressive interventions made by both at the security front and both at the social front, they are finally bearing results now. And the incidence of LWE violence have reduced by almost 70% from a high of 2,258 incidents in 2009 to 665 in 2020. Similarly, the deaths of civilians and security forces, that has also come down from a high of 1,005 in 2010 to 183 in 2020. This is the data provided by the Ministry of Home Affairs in the Lok Sabha last year. And previously, there were areas where no administration or government officials could go, but now considerable inroads have been made, and the Inspector General of Bastar, P. Sundar Raj, he issued a statement a few days ago that they have been able to reclaim 8,000 square kilometers of areas in Bastar division alone, which is one of the most first affected by LWE violence. And this has happened in the past 2 years alone. And they have also opened 21 security camps. So what happens is, whenever you open a security camp in these areas, you also bring in a lot of development, and there will be a post office, there will be a market, so people will come, there will be a market. So this also leads to development as we would like to see it, but there is a concern among the locals there that this development is being done at what cost. If you ask the people there if they want to part with the natural resources there, because most of the people who live there are Adivasis. They revere nature, they worship nature. So that is also an that is also be taken into consideration when we talk about development and we talk about industrialization of these areas. So and the other area, I will not like to talk about Jammu and Kashmir, because whenever you mention internal security, the first thing that comes to mind is Jammu and Kashmir, because that gets a lot of disproportionate attention, both by media and both by people, because it is too much coverage is given to it. So I will refrain from talking about that today. And the other area which I would like to point out is the Northeast. And they were compared to the peak of insurgency in the last 2 decades. There has been a phenomenal improvement in the security situation in the Northeast. And similarly, like LWE areas, sustainable efforts over the past 2 decades have resulted in lot less incidents and lot less casualties. And though the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which gives unhinged powers to the armed forces to search and arrest anyone without a warrant, it does exist, is still imposed in these areas. But we have seen incident-wise, there has been a considerable reduction. And a thorn, which I might describe it, the Naga Peace Pact. It is yet to be, we heard in 2015 that the government has had signed a framework agreement with the NSC and IM, which is the largest Naga group that is in talks with the government. But from then, it's 2021 now, we are yet to see any concrete development on that front. And I think that will be all from my side. I think Gopal sir will can elucidate us better now.
Okay, I'll thank you, Vijeta, for a very comprehensive overview of the topic. Is very vast, and therefore I will be focusing on a few issues, speak for about 15-20 minutes. The first few minutes I'm going to be speaking on what I call as the successes of India's internal security situation. I think the one obvious success is that we are still a functioning democracy. Our territorial integrity is by and large more or less being maintained. We've had elections, we've had change of governments. If you see what was there in 1947, 1950, the power equations itself in almost every single state has changed, and people, different communities, different ethnic groups, different castes have taken power, lost power, and that functioning democracy, however imperfect, has risen up to what I call as various challenges which have taken place, as you mentioned, J&K, the left-wing extremism, the Northeast, and in fact even the Khalistan struggle at one point of time in Punjab, which to an extent was perhaps one of the most critical as far as the Indian state was concerned, because it dealt with the border state and with a very sensitive population. So that's, in one sense, I would put it as just broadly at the background of what I call as the successes. If I look at the challenges, and I'm going to be speaking on 5 broad issues, the most important challenge is for us to actually develop and put in place a national security policy. 70 years after independence, we do not have a national security policy. And because we don't have a national security policy, there is still a lot of confusion between what the state should do, what the center should do, what different ministries have to do, and everybody, in one sense, working in silos. Just to give you an example, when you're tackling left-wing extremism, it's not purely just a law and order issue. As Vijayata mentioned, there are a lot of socio-economic issues, development issues, and that is not something which the Ministry of Home Affairs is competent to do. And therefore, unless you have that national security, the security architecture by which these problems are dealt with by every wing of the government, we run into problems down the line. So we don't have a national security policy, and as a result of that, I'm just speaking from experience, you would be surprised to know that the cabinet note for construction of roads in left-wing extremist states was initiated by the Home Ministry. The construction of mobile towers for better communication in left-wing extremist states, the cabinet note is proposed by the Home Ministry because we know that our forces need communication, therefore you need mobile towers and so on and so forth. For the other ministries, which are the line ministries, because this concept of a national security policy is not integrated into their work, for them this is incidental. It's something, it's a sideshow. So if I have a budget in the health ministry, I can spend it. I can build primary health centers, infrastructure in, shall I say, more accessible areas, and leave the backward areas which are left-wing extremist activities are there. I can leave it there, saying that I can't go there, my officers will not go there because the situation is so unstable, without realizing that this is a common thing which all of us have to work together to get doctors in, get teachers in, get the markets open, get the roads open, so that you finally get the ultimate beneficiary, or the focus is basically the people of that area. So that is something which we've not paid enough attention. And for years to come, the National Security Advisory Board, of which I was a member at some time, we had actually made a national security policy. The UPA government did not accept it. They said, it's all right, very good, nice paper, but they were not willing even to put a draft on the web for inviting larger consultations with think tanks and others across the board, state governments and so on. And the NDA government under Prime Minister Modi, with all its focus on national security and so on, the presentation was made to the Prime Minister, but it hasn't seen the light of day thereafter. So somehow people still feel that the importance of not having, or the real problems which we face because of this is not being understood. I think in one sense, it is most important that we start focusing on this national security policy. And it's one of the big challenges, because you don't have this national security policy, you will find that many things which should have happened, or we've made the basic structure, like the NCTC, after the Mumbai attacks, National Counterterrorism Center should have been opened, put everything into place. And because you don't have this security national policy architecture to get this into place, it died a natural death. Nat grid, you had the national intelligence grid. Again, you don't have the policy infrastructure for a security policy. It didn't see the light of day, even though for 2 years we were able to get something going. But thereafter, it shouldn't depend on individuals. It doesn't work. So that is, I think, one important aspect of having a national security policy in place. That's the biggest challenge insofar as internal security is concerned, because otherwise you'll do bits and pieces and you will never be able to solve a problem to, shall I say, not solve it, at least manage it to a level where it is, 90% is solved or 95% is solved, it's only 5%. But you're leaving it at 60, 70%, and the 30% always remains unsolved. That's one. The second issue is really basically, it also follows from the national security policy, because that will come in, is actually the constitutional and legal changes that are required to tackle internal security issues. When the constitution was formed in 1950, nobody talked of cybercrime. Nobody was talking of human trafficking. Nobody was talking of cross-border terrorism. These were things, aspects which came up much later as technology developed and countries developed. So we don't have a system by which where today public order, police are state subjects. But everybody knows that you can't tackle a cybercrime by saying police is a state subject. Therefore, if a cybercrime takes place in Kerala, the Kerala police can't do anything because the crime may be committed by somebody in Russia or Latvia or United States or Europe. So how do you manage that? You cannot do it unless you start developing structures which will be able to tackle these issues. And therefore, some form of constitutional amendment will be required, where at least certain aspects. I know the states are very sensitive. It is so sensitive that the NCTC, I'm just giving an example, when we set it up, when we broached the idea and pushed it, even a state like Gujarat, where the Prime Minister was the Chief Minister, he totally opposed it, saying that no, you are violating states' rights under the Constitution, we'll oppose it. The same person, when he came to Delhi, he said it's very important, it has to be done. But then he found that the same reaction was coming from all the other states, including the state of Gujarat from where he left. They also said, no, it cannot be done. So your perspective changes from when you're in the center and the states without looking at the larger national security architecture. So we need those changes, because if you don't have, you've got this NIA, which is the National Investigation Agency, but that deals only with a very, very limited number of cases where you have to issue a notification and so on, which came up as a result of the 26/11 attack. The third major challenge which I see, and which you also mentioned, Vijayta, is I think the radicalization of the majority and minority communities. Both these have taken this radicalization, majority community by virtue of propaganda and messaging within India itself, and the radicalization of the minority community also with a lot of external links because of the worldwide jihadi networks and the organizations that are coming in. And this is something which we'll have to face, because there are a whole pile of counter de-radicalization strategies which are being, shall I say, adopted, followed in different states with limited elements of success. I think for India, it's important that because of our unique both family structure and community structures, we have to work through these family and the community structures to try and stop or reduce the impact of radicalization on the communities. The fourth aspect, which I think is very critical, is actually on what I call as the reform of the criminal justice system. There are any number of committees which have been put, a number of issues have come up. It's basically, if you don't get justice on time, justice delayed is justice denied. And therefore, with the backlog of cases pending for years and decades in courts, people then look for other remedies because they can't afford to wait for a decision by the courts. It takes a long time, and therefore you find all these other informal structures which come up outside the regular features to try and solve some of these issues which people need to get in place. And the last, and I'll mention is actually the technological changes. You mentioned that, Vijayta mentioned about the fact of the economic development. Economic development also comes about, and the changes are taking place right across the board. You will find that technology itself is now making it easier for the security agencies, but it's also creating a very vast number of problems, because you have technology, cybercrime going by leaps and bounds. In fact, I don't think even 5% of cybercrimes in India get reported. 95% nobody reports it because the companies don't want it to be known that they have been hit. They pay up the money quietly, ransomware and so on. You've seen that 2 recent cases, the one on the pipeline in the USA, where $5 million was paid. And you've now seen yesterday the Irish healthcare system is also taken down because, again, they want money. So cyber, the technology has also made us extremely vulnerable. And this is a problem which helps the police because you can use drones, you can control crowds better, you get better access through the use of mobile phones and the drone technology and so on. But you also have the corresponding deficiencies in the entire system. The last and perhaps which is linked to all these, of course, is what is rising inequalities. Just not in India, it's across the world. You just cannot have a system where this level of inequality in a country can flourish, and you can then expect progress, and you can expect, law and order to be, shall I say, stable. Every country has a little bit of crime, every country has deviance and so on, but you have to, if people have no hope, if people have nothing to look forward to, then as Vijayata mentioned, it's snatching and other low order crimes will become rampant because people find that they have nothing to lose because the rate of conviction being what it is, as I mentioned, the criminal justice system being so delayed, it's about less than about 10% on an average. And if that is so, it means that 90% of the crimes committed are undetected or there's no punishment. And therefore, if you are starting a business where you have a 90% chance of success, it's a most profitable venture, and every entrepreneur in crime will move towards this because this will be the most lucrative business compared to any other form of business. And therefore, this is an aspect which is going to be extremely critical, that if you are not able to control the rising inequality and provide jobs, and you have to provide jobs in a totally different manner. I know in the technology itself, people say that a lot of jobs will be created. You're creating a vast amount of jobs which are basically in the lower income groups. The higher income groups, the technological groups, which are people who deal with artificial intelligence, data analytics, machine learning, and so on, they will get paid very well. There's a big demand for such people. But you will find that the rest of the workers will suddenly find themselves, the disruption will be so huge that unless you take adequate precautions to ensure that there is a social security net for all of them, crime is going to bloom right across the country. So we have these challenges. I will speak when some questions and answers are raised. It's such a vast topic. I've not raised issues on, aspects which deal with climate change itself. We are predicting a water shortage in India. About 30% of Indians will face a water shortage by 2030. What will happen when that happens? What kind of law and order situations will arise is another aspect which will be dealt with later. So I'll stop here and then questions, comments, if there are any.
Yeah, I think I might have a question, sir. Yeah. I have two questions. First, you spoke about centralization of powers, giving more, bringing constitutional changes so that center could take more decisions when it comes to internal security. But of late, we have seen the kind of tussle between state governments and the center. The trust is almost nil. I will give you an example of West Bengal. West Bengal has not been sending data to the NCRB for the past 2 years. So what NCRB has been doing is they have been just publishing the 2018 data for West Bengal. So this is the kind of political what do I say? How do I call it? Friction between the two, between the opposition and opposition TMC and the BJP at the center. That these things earlier there were differences between political parties, but it was not it did not percolate at the bureaucracy. These were standard things. NCRB report is not something secret. It's just a compilation of crime in a particular state. Even that is not being sent, and the And so how do you expect that in a scenario like this, states would want to give up their powers and would want to empower the state? And we have also seen in Kerala, in other, even in West Bengal, center has given security to BJP MLAs, and in Kerala, ED goes and files a case against the government officials there. So I'm not going into the merits of the case, but at the outset, as a layman, you see there is a lot of friction. So how do we reach a consensus? And the second question is, we often hear the word insurgent being used for incidents in the Northeast. For Kashmir, it is terrorism. In LWE areas, it is extremism. Why these different terms for different areas? I mean, the issue is the same. You invoke UAPA both in Kashmir. Also, you invoke UAPA in Northeast. Also, you invoke UAPA in LWE also. But why this? Why the different lexicons in use, even by government?
Okay, I'll just on the first, I fully agree with you that you need there's need for a lack of there is currently a little bit of lack of trust. You need to develop that. Earlier, I'm not saying it was not there. You had differences even on tackling left-wing extremism. I remember when I was Home Secretary and the Chief Minister of Bihar said that left-wing extremism is not my priority. I'm focusing on development, so I'm not. This is not my priority. So for us, because we don't want a situation where somebody the Maoists can move across into Bihar when they are under pressure and think that's a safe sanctuary because the Bihar police have been told don't take action against Maoists. So in those type of things, and this is where we have worked with the All India cadre of both IAS, IPS. The whole purpose of that time was when such a cadre was itself put is that you tend to reach out because your batchmates, your cadre mates, your juniors, subordinates are there. And that is how, shall I say, in spite of the Home Minister and the Chief Minister of the state being at loggerheads, at the bureaucratic level between the Home Secretary and the Home Secretary of the state and the DJP, we are able to work out in a sort of a wide data below the radar, literally without the Chief Minister and others knowing about it itself, to work out situations where when there is an operation, etc., the DGP of Bihar would move forces to the border to make sure that others can't cross in, etc. So these are some of the informal arrangements which happen sometimes when in a democracy there is different perceptions. So that is why I said when you set up the national security policy itself, all these issues are going to come up. I think the constitutional and legal changes is going to be part of one of the aspects in the national security policy itself. And that is why you need a large element of what shall I say, dialogue, discussion, pros and cons, what can you do, what cannot you do with the enhanced powers and so on. And I fully agree, if today there's this total lack of trust, I think, putting all the Bengal MLAs under central security, from my point of view, it's a stupid decision. I don't know how the director of the Intelligence Bureau can give a report saying that they will not get protection from the state police. If he has given such a report, I think he should really be sacked. I mean, that is the type of thing. The Home Secretary has to put his foot down and say this will not happen. So these are things which I think the bureaucrats in many areas today have also given up a little bit of their what is known as their right to act, not only at the bidding of the political masters, but they have also certain rights under the constitution, under this thing where they are supposed to act. So I think that is a process. I think this insurgents, terrorist extremism, etc., these are all just what I would call as, these are usage that has fallen into place. And again, I come back to, you need a national security policy which will then say that, look, everybody will be treated the same. If you're looking at anybody who takes up arms against the state, the overthrow, you will say, you will call him by a common definition. It should be part of national security policy. We still have wide variations because you have AFSPA in Kashmir, you have AFSPA in the Northeast in some areas. You don't have AFSPA in the left-wing extremist areas. And the Prime Minister says the most serious internal security threat of the country is in LWE today. But you don't have AFSPA. Why? So these are issues that need to be discussed, and you have to come to a consensus why you are not doing it, why you should do it in other places, and whether AFSPA itself should continue for so long in all these states. I mean, I was one of those who fought the case in the Supreme Court to justify the constitutional validity of AFSPA. Even there, we had said that every 6 months the AFSPA will be reviewed. And only when everybody is in consensus that AFSPA needs to be extended, then only it will be done. So that again is an assurance given by the government to the Supreme Court itself. Nobody is really taking up that. And we need far more vigilant public and vigilant media to highlight some of these, shall I say, aberrations that are taking place. And I hope it happens.
I hope so. Sir, you mentioned about AFSPA. So the peculiarity of AFSPA is it's different in J&K, as you mentioned, and it's different in Northeast. So a couple of years back, the Home Ministry actually asked the states in Northeast that we want to remove AFSPA, we want to delegate this power to you. You decide what you have to do. We don't want to, keep issuing these notifications. But Assam was given the choice, but Assam continues to issue AFSPA notifications for a year, and Assam has declared the whole state as a disturbed area. So does not this also impact development? Why will an investor want to come in a state which the state government itself is admitting that it's a disturbed area?
First, I'll be possibly correct if my own feeling is that in AFSPA in Assam currently today is only used in the border, 10-kilometer strip on the borders with Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, and so on. It is not applicable to the rest of Assam. Nagaland, yes. Meghalaya also has no AFSPA. Arunachal Pradesh has no AFSPA. Manipur has no AFSPA in Imphal city, but AFSPA is there for the rest of Manipur. Tripura, there is no AFSPA. And Mizoram, there is no AFSPA. So that's the change which has taken place over the years. Nagaland, in spite of the state government and the state assembly, and with the law and order situation, what it is, it's a fit case where there is no justification for extension of AFSPA in Nagaland, especially with the peace process and the violence at such low levels, possibly lower than any other state. So that is Kashmir itself. We tried very hard. At that time, you remember in 2009-11, we tried very hard to get a number of states which had no districts in Jammu and Kashmir, which had no violence for 3-5 years, no deaths, and no incidents, like the district of Gandarbal and so on and so forth, for 5 years. We said, why can't we remove AFSPA in that area? Because that's you want to give it, that's a bonus to the people of that area that if you have no incidents, you've been able to, shall I say, keep out the militants or the terrorists, etc., then we will withdraw the army from those areas and so on and so forth. So it didn't happen, but it's finally a political decision which they have to take it.
Sorry, Vijayta. There's a huge list of questions.
Yes. You can take the questions.
If we can start there, I think we have about 20 minutes, so we can start taking those.
You want to read out the questions or somebody speaking?
Pallavi?
Vijayta, you can read it out just to use the,
There's a question for you on the negotiations with NSA and IM. And he was the question mentions you as the Union Home Secretary during 2009 to 11. He was also a member of the NSAB and chairman. Sorry. I think I'm reading the profile. I'm so sorry. Sir.
Yeah, okay. I'll of the NSCNM negotiations.
Yes.
The NSCNM negotiations started when I was, in 1997, when I was the Joint Secretary Northeast. That's the ceasefire first. And then subsequently, when I came back as Home Secretary, we again initiated the negotiations. We had the former Chief Secretary of Nagaland, Mr. Pandey, as the main interlocutor. We changed the interlocutor at that time. And negotiations went on very well. I think we had reached about 95% of agreement on most of the issues. I've been on record saying that basic issue was not on the issues in Nagaland, but on the Manipur area, which was the Naga Hill districts in Manipur. What sort of degree of autonomy to the district councils there. And unfortunately, we were not able to, shall I say, clinch the deal, partly at that time due to the opposition by the Manipur Chief Minister to the political call. But by and large, there is a broad framework of agreement which is there in place. That came into, in 2015, was finally put as a framework agreement, which didn't mention any of the detailed, negotiations on 31-point charter of demands which the NSCNIM put out. And, but that time the compulsion was, the NSCNIM, Isaac Siu was in very poor health and he passed away. So there was pressure from the NSCNIM to have some sort of a framework agreement where Isaac Siu's signature was also on that document. And so that framework agreement was put. And I think it's a deal that's possible. I think we have not been able to, shall I say, clinch it because again, a little bit of lack of trust has come. Partly because, at one point of time, the J&K autonomy constitution within a constitution, we've got, when in the Northeast, we've got, Schedule 6, we've got Article 244A, a state within a state and so on, provisions in the constitution. I think the abrogation of Article 370 and the fact that the state, without consultation, the center could do this, I think it led to a certain element of distrust among the Naga leaders as to, can we trust the government of India? Because they may say A, B, C, D, but they promise this. But if they can go back and abrogate anything, they can abrogate any deal with us. And that lack of trust has not been able to be bridged, which is why for the last 6 years you've had the negotiation. By 2019, when Article 370 abrogation took place, I think that lack of trust has come and you have to build it up again.
Okay. So there's a question from Roy K. He asks, will the amendments to the Constitution for National Security Policy violate the basic structure of the Constitution?
No, I don't think so. See, insofar as the internal security is concerned, there are not very many, it's not major changes. It's more of on the practical aspects of, shall I say, a cybercrime. Now, how do you do a cybercrime if it happens in Kerala and the perpetrator is in Jharkhand? How does the Kerala police will be able to go and investigate in Jharkhand? Can they do sort of thing? You have a cybercrime network. Or if it is international one, you need the center to take over that, and then you have the interaction with other agencies. Because if something is happening from the US, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is, under the terms of bilateral agreements, we make a request to the FBI. The FBI then tells you that this IP address in some state in America belongs to so and so. They will then follow up. They'll arrest the person, and then we have to seek an extradition for that person to be brought to India for that crime. So that sort of international cooperation is something which only the center can do. You can't have each state, Kerala or Jharkhand or Daman and Diu negotiating with individual crime agencies, FBI or other agencies in different countries. So you will make that framework for saying that in these type of crimes, human trafficking, which again, within India, it's much easier. if it's international, would they go out from country to country? You have that. So these are the type of things which I think we need to work out the details. What people are most worried about is that the sharing of information people always have. And this is again what you mentioned. If you have a lack of trust between the center and the states, it won't work. You have to, in democracy, you need that basic element of trust. And therefore, you will then have to set up agencies, which are, shall I say, independent agencies, where if the center and the state say that the center says, I want this, or I'm sending my team to do this investigation, and the state says it is totally something not covered by this amendment which we have sought, you must have an agency to which both parties can go. And then that should be an independent, maybe headed by a retired high court judge or somebody, it goes, and he is then, you go to him and he makes this. It's the same like we do for any unlawful activities agency, whether it's ULFA or whether it is, CPI, Maoist and so on. Under the UAPA, within 30 days of, really within 6 months, the government has to go to this sitting judge, present all the evidence before him, and say, he has to then say that, yes, based on this evidence, what you have done is correct, that it is. And even the agencies who have been, CPI Maoist itself can come and make a representation saying that, we should not be banned, because we are not ABCD. So that sort of thing is something which you have to set up those agencies, and that's the sort of, but unless you debate, discuss, and come to a compromise on issues, and the trust must be on both sides.
There is a lot of politicization of police also. We saw that in the Sushant Singh Rajput case, Bihar police, suo moto registered a case, and their officers went to Mumbai and they were being pushed around by Mumbai police. It was a despicable scene. Anyway, we have another question by Colonel Ram Thagre. Is India looking at CBRN threats under national internal security? COVID-19 is a national security issue too. Are we geared for CBRN threats? Do we have a national CBRN security strategy?
Yeah, we are geared for CBRN threats. CBRN threats are handled by the specialized agency. It's actually a division of the National Disaster Management Authority. So we have the hazmat teams and the people who are trained to deal with these sort of things. So these are part of, because the National Disaster Management Authority comes under the Home Ministry, and therefore this is a internal security issue which comes. That's why you've seen even in COVID when it came, they used under the NDMA Act and this thing to make what regulations were needed to be done.
There is an interesting question from Ashmita De. Most of the India's internal security concerns are also Pakistan-centric. Will it going to remain the same?
No, I don't think most of our internal security threats are not Pakistan-based, except for in J&K. I don't think it's really a major issue. I mean, I don't think any left-wing extremism, we have really no evidence of Pakistan trying to get themselves involved. They've tried to come in. I'm not saying they won't do. Anybody will try to meddle in, troubled waters. People will come to muddy the waters. You've had, of course, in the northeast, because you had East Pakistan at one point of time. So when there was the trouble in some of the states in the northeast, people from the northeast went and got sanctuary across in East Pakistan. And obviously, some of them have been trained and armed and so on and so forth by Pakistan. But Pakistan is not our major threat. Our major threat is our own. If we present a unified democracy within India, where we listen to each other, we are accommodative to each other, outside threats come in when they are able to exploit your differences. So we have to, the function of political parties and democracy is to try and minimize and give confidence to people in India that you don't have to look elsewhere. You'll get your solution or you'll redress your grievances. The redressal of grievance is possibly the single most important aspect of, what we call as, the rule of law and in democracy. If you are looking for somebody else to redress your grievance. And in Maoist, actually, left-wing extremism is actually, it's a failure of the state. It's the only homegrown insurgent movement in India is the left-wing extremism, because it's a failure of the state to solve people's problems.
So there's a question again from Royan. He asks, in the past few years, we see a lot of fake messages and doctored images circulating in social media that increases hate. Some of them being spread by people having good positions in the National Party. How could we tackle that?
Yeah, social media is one. It's a big issue. I don't think any country has found the answer to it. Both the false news that comes, the hate news that comes, the fake news that comes, and the deep fake news which comes. It's, you can get anything done and it can create a problem before you can even get it taken down, because it spreads like wildfire. So this is we've not been able to. I don't think anybody has found a. It's a more of the alert citizenry that if you get something and you're getting a lot of things which are people are forwarding, you're not the first. You should be double checking it, fact check to see whether it is true or not. I think agencies need to be put in place where something like this goes viral. You should be able to go to somebody and say, is this true? And you should have that independent agency which will come and say, okay, we fact check it and we say that this is not true. And that is the only way it can be checked, because it's something which we've developed. It's like the genie in the box that is very difficult to put it back again.
But we have seen, particularly in the case of women, when women are targeted on social media, they are harassed. There is not much knowledge or know-how about how to deal with these cases, because most of these desks are handled by men who don't find these things offensive. I am myself a victim, and I went to the police station and the IO asked me, "Madam, aapko isme itna bura kyun lag raha hai?" So these are the issues that women regularly face. So you think that gender sensitization is also very important of the police?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the gender sensitization, both in the police as well as much larger, is there, because patriarchy is there in many societies across India. It's not something that is new. And unfortunately, in India, we are one of the first countries that gave women the universal right to vote. There's no other country at the time of independence before India which gave at the time of their independence the women the right to vote. We gave. So even a country like Switzerland, the last woman to get a vote in Switzerland in the last canton was 1979. Till 1979, the women in Switzerland could not vote in that canton because they were considered below men and not required to vote. Even the United States, women got the vote, all that suffragette movement, and they got it in the early 20th century, 150 years after independence. So we've done that. I think we still need much more women's empowerment. It's across the board. It's something that we just have to work at. You need representation of, I think, mandatory, 30% of police people must be women. There must be police women in the force, so that every police station can have at least, 5 or 6 women who will then, when women come to complain, you can have that type of, you do not have to go and, describe what happened or what any particular incident and so on. So these are changes which need to be done, and these are, unfortunately, we are not seeing adequate progress in that. Even a state like Kerala, from which I come from, I am very disappointed that the percentage of women in Kerala in this recent elections is the lowest in the last, I think, 30 years or something. So women are not, even though 30% of all the women Jilla Panchayat presidents, Jilla Panchayat presidents, or the Panchayat presidents are all women. But somehow I think women have to, take a view, and they're 50% of you have to say that you vote for a woman, irrespective of which party she belongs to. And the moment you do that, then I think they'll start putting more women, because 50% of the women vote for, in any constituency, they vote for the woman, irrespective of which party she belongs to. Everybody will start putting women on the, so that campaign has to come.
Sorry, Vijayata. Sir, both of you, can we extend by about 5 to 10 minutes? There is a lot of questions and very interesting.
Okay. I have something at 12:15. So,
Sure, sir. We'll try to end it as fast as possible. Vijayata.
okay.
Yeah, there's a question by Pranali. Why can't we recruit intelligence officers from the open market?
Intelligence officers from?
Open, like lateral entry, maybe. She means.
There is lateral entry, some lateral entry is being done, especially in the technological field, because with cybersecurity being so critical, the IB does recruit people laterally, because the people who are, everybody who's literally 50 plus or 45 plus is technologically handicapped, unless they are, particular personal preference for that. So there is a lot of lateral recruitment which is taking place, and we even have to, some places we've had to reduce the qualifications, because some of the best cyber hackers or ethical cyber hackers are actually people who are not graduates and who are not, would not meet, but they will be, they may be 20 years of age or 25 years of age. MI6 has, and Britain, they recruit on like an internship basis. Everybody at the age of between literally 12 to 19 should go and see their cyber hacking center. 12 to 16 boys and girls are just, they come in there, Bermuda shorts and tops and so on and so forth, and they come and they're only thing, they're given a computer and go and hack into the world. So this sort of thing is being done, and agencies are one, direct entry. Second is they're also outsourcing many to some problems. They outsource it to people they know. So all agencies have list of people who are, so they say what they call as the ethical hackers, and they use them very extensively.
So there's a question by Ans George. What is the status of peace negotiations with ULFA?
ULFA is almost dead. It's the last Paresh Barua. I think they're just waiting for Paresh Barua to die, and that will be the end of it. Everybody else has come. Most of the leaders have come. You will always have a few people. He's got some money. He's able to manage a little bit. He continues. I think ULFA is it's a spent force as far as they have some nuisance value. Anybody will have. You can have a bomb blast here and there once in a while, but it's a totally spent force.
Okay. There's a question again I think on hate speeches being promoted by political parties on social media. I think you've answered that, but if you want to.
Yeah, see, all hate speeches have to be, people have to come very strict down. I think the courts have not been, they have to take a far tougher line. In many of the cases, I'm finding the courts are, even where somebody is arrested and detained, the courts, at the end, they say past picture saying that, no evidence was done and non-application of mind and so on. I think the courts have been too liberal. I think that where they find non-application of mind or no evidence was there, I think a few of these investigating officers who have done this are concerned, district magistrate who has passed such an order or non-application of mind, I think he should be sent to jail. And I think if one person you send to jail, you will find that next time the police come to him with anything with no evidence and so on, he'll send it back saying that I'm not prepared to go to jail. I think courts today have to take that stand. That's the only way civil liberties will be protected. Make an example of one or two, and you will find the whole change taking place. I'm just hopeful that some high court, somebody will start to issue a notice to somebody why you should not be sent to jail for non-application of mind.
Yeah, we see this a lot happening in the OSA cases and sedition cases. The conviction rate is very poor, like less than 2%. And yet we see police filing sedition cases left, right, and center. Mostly, I think it is mostly got to do with what your political masters want, what your political bosses want. I think so.
Yeah, but you see, the problem is nobody is held accountable. No? So if the concerned SI who makes such a statement, if you find there is no evidence and the High Court then finally releases the person, if that SI is then sent to jail, the next time the political master says, he says, sorry, give it to me in writing that you want it, so that when I go to the court and there is no evidence, I'll say that you go to jail instead of me. I think and this is something which at least I have been, wherever I meet some of my judicial friends, I've been saying that courts need to make an example of at least one or two very obvious cases where absolute zero evidence, and you've detained somebody for 1 year or 1.5 years by the time it comes up to the court, and then you say that you release him by passing these off-the-cuff remarks, which is good for newspaper headlines, but that doesn't really serve the purpose. You have to send 1 or 2 to jail.
So I think the same applies in UAPA also.
Yeah, same. I agree. Same with in UAPA. Any case where people are not, it's shown that you have not applied your basic mind because you are depriving somebody of his liberty. And in such cases, bail was, obviously it was always the rule. Now you made bail the exception. And therefore, okay, if you're making bail the exception under UAPA, then you better well make sure that you have solid evidence. If you don't have solid evidence, then you should be held accountable.
I think we'll take the last question. Atul Adhikari.
Sorry, just one more question. I know Mr. Sinha, who's the former DGP Tripura, also wants to ask a question personally. So if you can give it to him, and then you can take Atul's question as the last one.
Okay.
Sinha sir, over to you. Sir, you're on mute. Sorry. Sir, you're on mute.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Sanjay Sinha. I'm a retired DGP of Tripura. I just wanted to ask you a question. Policing is a state subject, as you know, sir. And it being a state subject, there will always be difficulty in bringing about a uniform standard of policing in the country. CBI is not getting permission to investigate in all the cases. It has to wait for state government's approval. You yourself said that in Bihar in 2010 or 11, when you were the Home Secretary, the Chief Minister said that the LWE problem was not his priority was development. Do you think making law and order a concurrent subject will help? One retired Supreme Court judge had opined that if we bring it in the concurrent list, it could perhaps be helpful. Your views, sir?
Personally, I don't think it is a good idea. Most of the law and order problems can be solved locally. And Tripura is possibly one of the best examples of that. And as a former DGP, I must congratulate you and your force for literally managing and bringing an end to the insurgency in the state of Tripura. And you did it basically on your own. You didn't need the center to come in and do the work for you. And that is something which the state police and their officers and the political leaders had a great role to play. I don't think, when you're really looking at what I said, the changes, I want changes only in those aspects where there's interstate and international ramifications, where you need the center to be able to look at it in a much larger sense. Are there networks? Because you can have some cybercrime in Kerala, you can have another cybercrime in Tamil Nadu and somewhere. All three may be done by the same group, which is either abroad or in Jharkhand or in Delhi or whatever it is. Now, if each state is trying to investigate, etc., if you don't have some sort of a central agency for some of these, or at least the coordination, there'll be a lot of duplication of effort, and people are able to get away with that. So my limited focus was basically on that. Even today, I still feel that the central government, the central paramilitary forces have, we've got a huge battalions, hundreds of battalions of central paramilitary forces. I wish that many of them were actually used for augmenting the strength of the state police forces, because the state police states are financially more difficult, and therefore the center with the funds has actually raised these forces, which I think should have been better utilized by giving it as a grant to the states for augmenting their police forces and modernizing the state police forces. I think it may have served a better outcome.
I think we can take the last question from Atul. Regarding partial removal of AFSPA within a state, wouldn't it create a vacuum within the CICT grid?
See, you've seen the case of Manipur. You got the whole of city of Imphal is non-AFSPA. Rest of, has it created a grid? I don't know. I think people within the Imphal, the state police is managing. I don't think there is some coordination with the army and so on. But I don't think it's created a big problem. See, AFSPA it's an emergency. It's a situation of last resort. The Indian Army comes in when you say that AFSPA is imposed, when you say there's a total breakdown of law and order, the state administration is not able to function, and therefore you're calling in the army. That has to be for a very limited, because the army is not designed to take on its own citizens. It takes on an external enemy. So you can't train the army will go in strength. The army will, it's a hammer blow. So the army must use that hammer blow for, whatever, 15 days, 60 days, and so on, and then go back. You can't keep the army on a AFSPA for years together. So then what happens is that then you start developing vested interests. Then you have a vested interest because there's so much you get extra funds, you get extra money, etc. And then you have all the other problems which come with it. That should really not be there. The army should be used if you come to a situation where state police forces and central paramilitary forces cannot handle the situation. I mean, I should say you declare president's rule and take it over, and you do what you want to do within a fixed period, 6 months, get the thing done and restore it back again. I think, see, the counterinsurgency grid, you can always manage. See, this is the argument used in Jammu and Kashmir, saying that, look, if you take away AFSA from Gandarbal, then all the terrorists will all go and collect in Gandarbal. Nothing prevented them from collecting in Gandarbal, even now with the army there. And you had no incidents. You said the grid is there. Give it a try. See, finally, if the people want that, overarching presence of the army in the state, and it's only for people who've been in Kashmir, who live there and so on and so on. There's a difficulty for people if you have so much strength of the army, where you send your daughter to school and you are checked 6 times on the way. I mean, if you do that, then if you have it in Delhi, I'm sure people in Delhi will say, look, straight away remove the army from, this. Because it's just a harassment. It's just a irritation. You don't need that. So army should be on the border, cross infiltration, defend your borders, build up your state police forces, give them whatever is required, the additional money, and let them tackle the issue. I'm all for the state police forces much bigger role in internal security.
Yes, I think we're done with the questions.
Yeah, we can wrap up, I think, yeah. Anyway, sir has to go somewhere. So thank you so much I know that a lot of questions which did not go answered, but I'm so sorry about that because time constraint. But thank you everyone for keeping this discussion engaging, and thank you Vijayta for keeping it going, and with all your questions, and obviously Pallai sir for sharing his experience and insights. So thank you everyone, and have a good weekend. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Vijayta.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Vijayta. Thank you so much. Take care of.